just as the hymn which we just sang speaks of a relationship that we have with one another because of a relationship which we have with Christ, so the letter that Paul wrote to Philemon speaks of a new identity and a new relationship and grounds it in personal experience, in real life circumstance. Our hymn talks about weeping with those who weep and laughing with those who laugh. And we are pleased when we are able to share joys as well as concerns, and when we truly do carry the concerns of one another on our hearts in ways that lift them not only in prayer, but perhaps lift others as well. Sharing life together. It's what it means to be a community of faith gathered in Christ's name. Paul was hardly a radical. He was hardly a person interested in upsetting the apple cart, as it were, of life in that first century in the Roman Empire. He kind of took it for granted that there were certain things about life, certain inequities, certain divisions, certain social circumstances, certain conditions in which people lived, and that it wasn't his role to, in some way, lead an insurrection, as it were, challenging its injustices or taking it on head-on. And yet, I think throughout his writings, Paul presents a vision of the Christian church that is counter-cultural, that challenges some of the assumptions of the world and the society in which these very infant churches were formed. The issue of slavery was one of those. It was very much a well-established and ingrained institution. Certainly, even in the Hebrew scriptures, we know about slavery, for we know that God's people were at one time themselves slaves in Egypt. They knew its injustice, and there is a constant yearning for a treatment of one another that is equitable, caring, compassionate, and just. The Roman Empire had a well-established slave system. Some of its slaves were the result of foreign activity, wartime captures, individuals brought back within the Roman Empire and who were working for various Roman leaders. But there are also others who entered into slavery by other routes. Circumstances left their families mired in debt. And as a way to deal with debts, sometimes parents sold their children's labor and lives to others. So at the time that Paul is writing this letter, he would have been writing to a community that very much knew about the inequities of slavery, but it was a circumstance they accepted. And in other places, Paul speaks to slaves that they should be obedient to their masters, and that masters should be careful in the way in which they treat their slaves. He took it for granted, and yet here in this letter, he is suggesting a way in which the Christian message and Christian identity turns things upside down. We don't know a great deal about the circumstances under which Onesimus left the household of Philemon as a runaway slave. Whether, as some have suggested he had done some wrong, perhaps taken something, or whether, in fact, he may have been mistreated. All we know is that he had indeed run away. And this man, Onesimus, whose name meant useful, interesting way of naming a person, in the way one might name some piece of property, useful, had found his way to Rome. And he had come under the care of Paul, although Paul was imprisoned. He was one of a number of people who helped to provide for Paul during this period of his imprisonment. It was customary in those days that people who were jailed would have others who would bring them food and other items that they might need, and that might also carry letters and correspondence to those whom they wished to be in contact. And that during this period of time, Paul has developed a very close relationship with Onesimus. Onesimus has become a member of the Christian faith, and he is a useful person, very dear to Paul's heart. But Paul becomes aware that he is a runaway slave and that he was the former property of Philemon, who is also a close friend of Paul's. So Paul is writing to a friend, one whom he knows as a leader in the Christian church, and he's asking that he receive back this slave no longer as just a slave, but as a brother in Christ. That he welcome Onesimus home in the same way that he would welcome Paul as a guest in his home. He's asking this in a very gentle way. He's trying to appeal to all the good qualities he knows about Philemon, the way in which he has conducted himself, the care that he shows to those who are part of this faith community which he hosts, for the ways in which he has lived his life as a Christian. And he's asking Philemon to understand that now there is a new identity and relationship that exists. He speaks of family metaphors: father, son, brothers, sisters, friends. We don't know the exact circumstances nor the outcome of this letter, although we have some belief that the man who later became the bishop of Ephesus, Onesimus, Bishop Onesimus, may have been this same individual. And we know from other writings in the New Testament and from the early church fathers that Bishop Onesimus was among those who preserved the letters of Paul, these letters that circulated to the early churches, so that we have them as a reservoir of teachings for our own faith. Maybe the same Onesimus. We wonder sometimes, as I reflected on this passage and said, how does that speak to us? What does that invite us to think about, to reflect on? I think sometimes there is a tendency on the part of many to speak a strong voice for advocacy, to challenge the structures that are unjust in the world in which we live, to pound the pulpit and kind of try to shame people into treating one another better. I'm not a